across hills of Barn Crossing, as if it wanted to knock the last vestiges of life out of the land. Dust scraped under doors, gnawed into the cracks of old boards, climbed into the crevices of every shabby house, including the warped hut on the outskirts where Loretta Hatley lived. She stood over the hearth stirring the chowder, slowly, like a person who had no urgent business to attend to, much less guests. The brew was of rutabaga and hope. She had thrown the last piece of corned beef into the cauldron 2 days ago. Now only root vegetables and silence remained. Loretta was 35, broad in the hips, strong in the shoulders, with a face that Barn Crossing called good-looking, out of politeness, of course. Poor to embellish, and too smart to pretend it didn't matter. The neighbors had been whispering about her since she turned 20, first with pity, then with contempt, and now just out of boredom. She was heavy, where other women grew graceful. The seams on her dresses grew wider and wider each year as life passed her by. Once upon a time she had a dream, her own bakery. There was a time when the aroma of cinnamon and fresh dough seemed almost like freedom to her. But dreams, like bread without salt, go stale quickly, and Barn Crossing even faster. Parents were long gone. Her brother had lost the land in a poker game and disappeared. She'd been 23 at the time, and since then, she'd been trying to survive on the wreckage of a life that had never fit her. An old dog named Cole limped across the floor and put his muzzle on her knee. He was half-blind, with a bitten ear and a perpetual odor of swamp slime. But he was loyal. He didn't care that Loretta had calloused palms and strong hands. Through the murky window, she watched the sunset. The red light lay on the dust like a smear of blood on a dying man's cheek. Another day, another nothing. A knock on the door made her wince. No one came in, unless it was business. She opened the sash. Sheriff Melvin stood on the doorstep, always flushed, always with a flask in his pocket. He had come to tell her that there would be a dance in the hall next Saturday, and the women were bringing pies as usual. His tone was wryly deferential, as if he didn't know why he was speaking. The suggestion sounded more like a warning. Loretta gave him a cold stare, letting him know that she didn't need or want to be with people. He seemed to want to insert a phrase of comfort, but she closed the door before he did. Pie for the dance. She already knew how it was going to be. The sneers, the whispers, how a banker's daughter would giggle behind a lace fan and some fool in a cowboy hat would pretend to court, out of pity or for a bet. She'd seen it all before, but something heavy and old stirred inside her that night, smoldering rage, ash under her skin. She didn't deserve this life, but no one had come to save her, and she wasn't going to ask. The next morning she took the basket and headed for the hills. There were berries growing by Widow's Creek. If she picked enough, she'd make something sweet, not for dancing, for herself. The path was overgrown with thorns and snakes. The sun beat down on her back like a whip. But Loretta walked. She walked as if her last shred of dignity depended on it. She found berries by the brook as thick as blood. She bent down and began to pick, humming to herself. Suddenly the silence changed. Angle growled, she froze. The rustles were too loud, not the hair. 30 paces away stood a boar, a huge one, fangs that glistened like knives. He trembled with rage. She didn't scream, dropped the berries, grabbed a thick branch. The boar tore at it. She struck. The boar squealed, recoiled, and forward again. She ran. But the ground was crooked. She tripped, fell, rolled downhill. The boar was after her. She snatched up the knife, small, useless, but held it as her last hope. The shot ripped the air. The boar twitched, roared, and collapsed. Dust, blood, silence. The boar twitched again and froze. A rider emerged from the bushes, young, broad-shouldered, with tan skin and messy hair. A rifle hung behind his back. He dismounted from his horse and walked toward her, his gaze attentive but without alarm. They exchanged a few words. He asked if she was all right, and she, still with a racing heart, explained that she was just picking berries. He looked at the downed boar and remarked that it wasn't every day that he saw someone go up against death with a stick and a knife. There was something between admiration and irony in his words, but without mockery. She shook off her skirt and declared that she didn't need rescuing. He played along with a smile, saying, yes, that's what he saw, especially when she was about to stab the beast with her penknife. Their words flew like a light breeze. No tension, no calculation. He introduced himself. The name made her wince. Declan Thatcher, heir to a family that owned half the county. He didn't look like the son of a tyrant, but like a man who'd escaped something like this. They talked some more. He joked about her strong arms. She replied that he had the charm of a fox. He offered water from a flask. She drank, and he watched, not appraising, just interested. There was no mockery or pity in him. She joked about her humble treat, a stew of turnips and bad decisions. He laughed, remembering the worst dinner of squirrels and regret. The conversation continued somehow on its own, quiet, warm, almost cozy. When the sun touched the horizon, he stood up and suggested that he might drop by sometime to visit her. She tried to fend him off by dropping the phrase that he didn't know who she was. He didn't care. He said he'd drop by with some flour, since she was baking. She replied that she used to bake. He was gone. The horse led him away into the sunset, and she stood for a long time looking at the hoof prints, the dead boar, the crushed berries. And for the first time in a long time, Loretta Hatley didn't feel like her life was coming to an end. She sensed that something was just beginning. He came in toward noon. The sun was already burning the dust from the cracks in the ground, and Loretta had just finished feeding Cole and was moving a pile of dry wood to the shed when she heard the rhythmic crunch of hooves on gravel. Declan arrived on horseback, and the same warm, almost boyish smile that had made him disappear at sunset yesterday was still on his face. He had brought the flour as promised, and he did not seem to doubt for a moment that his visit would be accepted. Loretta met him at the door, still in her dusty apron, with a frown that couldn't hide the slight tremor in her chest. He stepped into the house, leaving the sun behind him, and looked around. The room had been cleaned, not for him, but for herself. The fire in the hearth flickered, and the smell of warm ash lingered in the air. He noticed the newly mended table. She just threw in a quick, "I'm fixing what I can." Then she added, almost without looking, "I was poor before it was fashionable." He didn't respond with pity, didn't shake his head, just accepted it as it was. Sat down to the table, silently, quietly. They began to knead the dough together. She measured the flour, accurately, habitually. He rolled up his sleeves, rubbed the butter, tried to copy her movements. The first knead was a failure, dense, rubbery, almost inedible. They both spat like children and laughed. The second one was better. The third was almost real. And the fourth filled the whole house with the smell of yeast and vanilla. And when the crust burst on top and sweet steam hit their nostrils, they both realized they had made it. A small miracle of flour and effort. He looked at her, she at him. And there were more words in that look than 100 confessions. Loretta smirked and said the success belonged to her because he'd ruined the first 2 loaves. He nodded, admitting defeat, but remarked that every good baker should have someone to mess up the need for balance. He came almost every day, sometimes with a sack of flour, sometimes with a bundle of stories from the fair or from a distant ravine where, he said, the most stubborn honeybee in the South grew. He left in no hurry, returned without warning. It was as if this road to her house had become as familiar to him as warm bread at dawn was to her, and every evening, under the shade of an old oak tree, they would sit and chat while the bread cooled on the windowsill. She was baking and always talking about something. He listened with interest, and somewhere in this ritual a new chapter of life began, in which everything suddenly became possible. Conversation flowed freely. Declan talked about his childhood on the ranch, about the horse that had once refused to cross the river, and stood there until evening, looking at him like an idiot. Loretta laughed like she hadn't laughed in a long time. He laughed back. No awkwardness, no reserved glances. Just 2 people who suddenly had a lot in common. One evening they were sitting under an old oak tree, another loaf cooling on the windowsill. The sunset was smearing the horizon with a light that looked like browned crust. They were silent for a short time, simply because they always had something to talk about. She asked why he was really here. Not here, at her place, in this wilderness, far from the family vineyards, from the expectations of family. He answered simply. He said he couldn't breathe in the midst of what was forced upon him, that everyone wants the same things from him: management, marriage, lucrative decisions. And he wants something else. And he likes to learn new things, to know what yeast smells like in flour, that he rather stand by the stove with her than in a stable with stallions. Loretta listened in silence, seeing him for the first time not just as a man running away from something, but as a man running towards something. She looked at her hands, the flour in the cracks of her skin, the burn on her wrist from the old frying pan, and suddenly felt that there was beauty in it all. He said she's the first one who doesn't play, who doesn't whisper, doesn't pretend, doesn't wait for the moment to use his name. He said there were no others like her, and that if anything real could start anywhere, it might be here, with her. She wanted to answer, but her throat constricted. The habit of loneliness wasn't just a wall. It was a crust that was hard to break through even with warmth. But she nodded carelessly, and he understood. They went back into the house, cutting the bread. The crunch of the crust seemed like the sound of something more than just dinner. They ate in silence, but this silence was not empty. It was complete, like an old trunk full of letters that no one had sent yet. Loretta slept more soundly that night than she had in months, and in the morning when she got up, he was already there. Again, and again there was reason to laugh, reason to make the day a little warmer than usual. Things had changed since that morning, not abruptly, not with a storm or a flash, but something subtle, like a morning mist that drifts over the ground without even touching it. Declan became part of her everyday life, like a cup that always sits on a shelf, even if it's not always full. They shared their days like they shared bread, unhurriedly, respectfully. They began to open up to each other. Hurriedly, perhaps, but not under pressure, like old drawers being opened, with a crunch of stagnation and a slight apprehension. Loretta told him about how, as a child, she had read recipes as if they were incantations, how she'd wanted to have chickens, but her father wouldn't let her, saying, "It's not for women with butcher's hands." He laughed, but not at her, beside her. It was as if his own childhood had been full of prohibitions, too, only other words, other walls. Declan didn't complain about his family, but Loretta heard more in what he didn't say. His voice trailed off when it came to his brothers. He crumpled the fabric on his knee with the palm of his hand when he remembered his father. He didn't go into detail, and he didn't need to. The look in his eyes spoke for itself. One day she asked him how he felt when he was alone. He shrugged, as if the question were about someone else. He said loneliness was like smoke from a campfire. You can't see it until it hits your eyes. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. She knitted something uneven. He sharpened his knife and read aloud pages from an old calendar he had found in the attic. The words there were simple: harvest, frost from the north, solstice. But they sounded as if they themselves were part of some forgotten tale. Loretta began to change. Not outwardly, though, her gaze became clearer. She began to hold herself not as a woman who expected to be asked, but as one who decided for herself what to say. Her sentences became shorter, but stronger. Every word had a point. One day she found an old mirror in the barn. She dusted it off, looked at herself, and didn't recognize herself. Not just because she was different, but because it was the first time she saw herself alive. That same day, back at the house, she found Declan with her old recipe book in his hands. He was leafing through the pages as if they were letters from the past. He didn't say anything when she approached, just closed the book and nodded, as if he'd realized something important. And he didn't say it out loud. That evening they sat closer than usual, and for the first time there was no bread between them, no stories, no filling silence, just breathing and presence, no fear, no commitment, just now. Loretta fell asleep on his shoulder. Declan didn't move, even when the fire was almost out. He just sat there as if he were holding not her, but the whole world, which had barely begun to breathe. Soon there was a fair in Barn Crossing. Wooden stalls covered with faded tablecloths lined the main street like a disorderly army. The air was thick with odors: smoked meats, smoke, sweets, dusty leather, and wet horses. Loretta left the house early, baskets in hand full of fresh bread. Not out of excess, but out of want. Money was melting like ice on a frying pan, and flour was not growing on the trees. She didn't like fairs. Too many eyes, too many faces, too much laughter not meant for her. But they took her bread. They spoke briefly, paid evenly, and that was enough. By noon she was standing at the counter when she felt a slight chill run down her spine. It always came like that. Not loudly, not suddenly, but palpable, like a change in pressure before it rained. She looked up and saw him. Declan stood between the broom shop and the honey barrels. Didn't approach right away. He watched. Then he walked toward her. His steps were sure, as if this street belonged to him, though he knew it didn't. "I didn't wait at home," he said when he got close enough. "I wanted to see what you look like among the others." Loretta nodded, hiding neither the fatigue nor the irritation, nor the shadow of joy that surged within her. "How so?" she asked. He looked around the counter, the bread, the people around him. "Like a light fixture in a dusty barn. Not where it should be, but exactly where it needs to be." She grinned. The two of them stood together amidst the hum of the crowd, not noticing the shouts or the clicking of horseshoes. He helped her sell the leftovers. Then they walked to the river, away from the noise. They sat by the water, throwing crumbs to the birds, not looking at each other. He started talking about family, about the letters he never sent, about his brother, who's probably looking for him, about how there was less and less time left. His voice wasn't shaky, but it was hoarse, as if each word had been through sandpaper. Loretta didn't interrupt. She just listened. And then she said that being afraid was not the same as giving up, that to live was to risk being seen, to be hurt, to be thrown away, but to live anyway. When they returned to the village, the fair was already going out. The sun was setting behind the rooftops, leaving light only on their faces. At the house she stopped, turned around. "Tomorrow?" I asked. "Tomorrow," he replied. And it was more than a promise. It was a decision. A week after the fair, the house smelled of more than bread. It smelled of business, the kind that grows from the ashes. The stove was humming from the morning. The table creaked with kneading, and the windows were open, not to the wind, but to the voices. Because voices were coming. People were coming. Cautiously at first, an old carpenter for a loaf, a widow with a child for a warm bun. Then more boldly, school children crowded at the door, breathing on the glass. Some of the teenagers offered firewood in exchange for a pie. Word traveled faster than the mail. Loretta's is good, Loretta's is kind, Loretta's is clean. She didn't open the bakery grandly, no ribbon or speeches. She just put a sign out front. Loretta's Bakery. The name that had been whispered with derision yesterday now sounded respectful. She wasn't hiding anymore, and neither was Declan. He helped with the flour, lifted heavy things, carried water, built a new shed out of boards. But most importantly, he didn't stop her from being in charge. He knew that here, in this place, she was the one who knew what victory tasted like after defeat. It was the same week that a stranger came to the village. A dark horse, military bearing, expensive saddle. He didn't say much, just went into the shop, looked at the window. He took a pastry, paid in silence. He left. The next day, Loretta found a letter on her doorstep. The paper was thick, the handwriting smooth, the signature that struck like a gunshot. Reed Radford. "You know who I am, and you know what you're doing. I'll come over. We'll talk." She didn't tell Declan. Not at first. Because something vibrated inside her again. Old, abandoned, something she thought was long buried. Fear, humiliation, anger, all at once. That night she baked in silence. Not because she was angry, but because she was thinking. The dough kneaded hard, as if sensing the change. Declan noticed. He didn't ask. He moved closer, put his hand on her shoulder. And without turning around, she whispered, "He's on his way." He understood right away. He didn't say anything heroic. He didn't go for his rifle. He just stayed by my side. He came quietly. No warning, no squeak of horseshoes. It was just that at some point Loretta had gone out to fetch water and saw a man in black standing in her shadow, like a thorn in the light. Reed Radford, Declan's brother. He had eyes that didn't ask anything. They were just fixing, like a scope. The smile was polite, almost friendly if you didn't know what was behind it. He didn't come into the house, didn't say why he was there. He said he was just passing through, that he thought he'd stop by. He said everyone missed him, that his father was worried, and that women like Loretta don't usually stay in the story long. She didn't answer. She just stared. and he realized that his words had gone nowhere. He walked away, leaving boot prints on the ground, and the air grew quieter. Declan returned in the evening. She told him, not right away, but she told him. He listened. His face didn't change, but there was something tight in it. He said that Reed was the messenger, that if he'd come, his father would be coming for him soon. Loretta didn't cry. She wasn't afraid. But that night, standing on the porch, she stared into the darkness as if someone was moving in it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt really cold. There were fewer customers in the bakery that morning. Some passed by, some turned away. One woman spoke in a whisper. Another left money without making eye contact. And so the wall began. First a thin one, then a concrete wall. Declan tried to help, to encourage. But this wasn't the kind of wound you could put a bandage on. It was old blood, the kind that had withered beneath the skin, the kind that seemed long forgotten, but stirred at the smell of the family saddle. She baked more than usual that day, not because they were expecting it, because no one had to say she'd given up. And in the evening, when the sun had gone behind the woods and everything around him felt like an exhalation, someone knocked on the door. Not confidently, not angrily, just a knock. A neighbor girl stood on the doorstep, small, freckled. She was holding a bowl. Mom said, you forgot your dish at our place yesterday, but Loretta never had a dish in there. And there was apple jam in the bowl, warm. She took it, closed the door, and stood with her palms pressed to the edge of the bowl for a long time, because it wasn't dessert. It was, I see. The morning after the jam was different. Loretta stepped out onto the porch and for the first time in days didn't check to see if anyone was watching her from around the corner. She just stood there breathing in the smoke from the chimney as if it were not smoke, but proof that the house was still alive and she was in it. Declan went down to the river. He wanted to catch something for dinner. She was alone, but there was no loneliness in the silence, only concentration. She set the water down, tossed her hair back in a bun, squared her shoulders, and opened the windows of the bakery. Not so much for visitors, primarily for herself. She kneaded the dough and added grated apples and cinnamon. Toward lunchtime, there was a knock at the door. A man this time. The same carpenter who had built the shed a few months ago for 3 coins and silence, and so it began again. Slowly, not heroically. No marches or banners. One man, then another. Someone asked for salt. Someone asked for a crust of bread for the dog. Someone said thank you with a look in his eyes. By evening she realized she had sold more in a day than she had in the previous week. People weren't just coming in. They were coming back. That night she ran out of flour. For the first time, not because there wasn't any, but because it all went to work. She laughed, standing by the empty sack, and Declan laughed with her, as loud as they could. For real. They went outside. They sat under a tree. He was smoking. She was silent, looking at the stars. Then she said, I thought if everyone turned their backs, I'd collapse. Turns out I wasn't standing on them. I was standing on me. He nodded, shook his hand. They rose and went back into the house, and behind the fence someone was watching them in the dark. The horse stood in the shadows. The man sat in the saddle, unmoving. He was watching, and the next day the whole town knew. Jonathan Radford had arrived at Barn Crossing. He needed no introduction, even to those who had never seen his face. Jonathan Radford is someone whose name was spoken in these parts without further ado, with a slight bow of the head, not out of respect, out of fear. He appeared, as always, on time. His horse trotted down Barn Crossing's main street like a carpet, saddle polished, shoes dustless. His face was calm but hard, like the surface of a mountain that no one had ever conquered. He didn't yell. He didn't demand. He just drove into the city. And the city began to crumble. In the evening, when Loretta was already closing up shop, he came up, alone. No guards, no theater, just stood on the porch like a man who owned everything, the house and the air and the silence around him. She opened the door, not because she was called, because she was afraid to back out. He spoke calmly, coldly, like a man who had come to demand an asset, not an emotion. He said his son had succumbed to weakness, that he was no Radford as long as he stood here in this house, amidst the agony in the woman's hands. He said that within these walls is shame, not love, not home, not meaning, a shame that touches his whole family. Loretta was silent, not because she didn't know what to say. It was because she didn't want to waste a word. He offered to let her go, with the money, with silence, a chance to disappear. The offer sounded like a suspended sentence, and she, wiping her hands on her apron, answered, "I've been a shadow for too long. Not anymore. Go away. I can still say that safely." He didn't hit. He didn't yell. He just drove away. The next day, the sign over her door burned down. Someone threw a bottle of kerosene. Someone watched and didn't stop. The flames weren't strong. Declan was able to knock it down before it spread. But the smell remained, and the black soot on the boards like a scar. Loretta stood in front of the charred board, lips clenched, fingers trembling, but not out of fear. It was because it was time. She went out into the street, right into the center of the square, and she shouted just one word. That's enough. People stopped. Some from the shop, some from the cart, some from the saloon. She stood in the middle of the street in her apron with soot on her cheek and spoke. She said she didn't ask for pity, she didn't expect to be saved, that she wasn't the most beautiful woman in the goddamn world, but that everything she had was built by her hands. And if anyone thinks that's a disgrace, they can say it to her face. At first there was silence, and then a step, one, a woman's, followed by another, a man's, then dozens. People came out, no words. They just stood around, and among them a carpenter, a widow, a schoolboy, a farmer. Barn Crossing stood up, not for a great slogan, but because everyone was tired of being afraid. The sign was put up again that night. Loretta's bakery was burned on it again. The next morning, after the sign had returned to its place, the town was surprisingly quiet. It was as if the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Loretta continued baking as usual, except there was a refinement in her movements that hadn't been there before. Not stubbornness, determination. Declan barely left her side. Not because he was afraid, because he knew the moment was coming. And it came. In the middle of the afternoon, 4 horsemen rode down the street. Jonathan in the lead, followed by Reed and 2 mercenaries, not dressed for conversation, dressed for business. They stopped right in front of the bakery. They got off their horses. Jonathan walked up first. His voice was the same as it had always been, flat, without a trace of rage. He called his son an outsider and Loretta a problem. He said he would not allow the Radford family to be associated with a woman who serves bread in dirty aprons to the poor. He demanded that Declan come back. Immediately, no scenes. Meanwhile, the crowd had already gathered. People stood along the street and around it silent. Some with their hands in their pockets, some with clenched fists. Declan was silent. Loretta stepped forward, the tensions building. You didn't come for a son. You came for power, control. The fear you've long held in these people, didn't you? She said. Her voice sounded clear, confident. She didn't shout, but her words echoed like a bell. I am not a disgrace. I am flour, water, and salt. Everything that makes bread. Everything that keeps life going. And if your own son is a disgrace to you, then maybe you don't need your own man, your own blood. You need a servant. Reed stepped forward. But before he could say a word, the farmer, the same one who had once placed the coins in silence, stepped between them. Next came the widow, then a teenage boy, the carpenter. One by one, without a word, stood shoulder to shoulder, between Loretta and those who wanted to take everything from her. Reed's voice broke sharply into gruffness. He stepped forward. His face was no longer hiding behind courtesy. There was mockery in his voice, a habit of breaking in his eyes. He began to speak, not to her, to the crowd, about who she was, about the past shaken out like dirty laundry on the steps, about how women like that don't make families. At best, they're drunks who spend their time with them until they have a few coins to buy a new bottle. At worst, they're locked up in a pigsty where they belong. And then Loretta stepped closer, stood in front of him, not backing away, and spoke, calmly, about the ground she dug with her hands, about getting up when everyone was still asleep, how people's mocking taunts hurt more than a whip, but still couldn't kill. She told him she wasn't born with a rich father, and her lot had dealt her many blows, but it wasn't for him and his face to talk about the pigsty. She was unbreakable, she asserted, and every word hit her like a rock. Reed couldn't help himself. His hand went to his belt for his weapon. He took a step, stepped closer, but before he could, the dry squeak of a loaded revolver. Declan. He stepped between, and nothing more was needed. Jonathan had been silent all this time. Only at that moment did he speak. His voice was low without anger, but the kind of voice that commands execution. He said that if his son didn't come back right away, his name would be erased from his memory, that he would disown him forever, that he would leave him no inheritance, no right to a shadow on his estate. The crowd froze. There was not just anticipation in the air, but fear that something was about to happen, that there would be blood, that the bakery would collapse in flames. But no one moved away. One by one, people still stood around him. And when Declan took a step back toward Loretta without turning around, it was clear he hadn't chosen a family home. Jonathan stood for a long time, stared, then turned away, from them, and from his former power. He and his men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a pall of dust and the bitterness of regret. When the dust settled, no one applauded, no shouting. They just started to disperse. But there was something new in the eyes. Respect, not as a hero, but as a human being. That night it was just the two of them, just sitting by the hearth. She rested her head on his shoulder. He put his hand on her knee. Once again, neither of them worried about tomorrow, because they both knew there would be a tomorrow. And that's what matters. It's been a while. Not much, just long enough for the village to forget the noise, but not the people who stood in the middle of the street. The bakery was working again. The sign no longer swayed in the wind. Now it held as firmly as the owner herself. Inside it smelled of vanilla, honey, fresh dough. But it wasn't the smell. It was the way people smiled as they came in. The way the kids knew where the cinnamon buns were. It was the way Loretta moved. Slow, dignified. She's different, more whole. And when she looked in the mirror, she no longer looked for approval. She just fixed her apron and went to work. Declan stayed, not as a guest, not as a hero, but as part of the wall like a fire in the furnace. He built a bench on the side for his carpentry shop, next to the bakery, not higher, not lower, next to it. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. Everything had already been said. Sometimes strangers would come. They'd say, "Are you the ones?" and nodded. And then they'd take the pies and leave an extra coin, as if for someone somewhere, choosing not to surrender. One morning, when the sun was barely up, Loretta went out on the porch with a cup of coffee, sat down, closed her eyes, listened to the silence. But it was broken by Declan proposing marriage to her. It was just an amazing morning, and of course she said yes. Dear friends, and thank you for being with us all the way to the end. We hope you enjoyed this video and the story of Loretta Hatley, a woman who stopped waiting for a miracle and became one for herself. Please support us with likes, comments, and subscriptions. This is very important to promote the channel and more and better stories in the future. Write down what you think. Did Declan do the right thing? And would Loretta have been able to do all this without him? Until we meet again. And remember, the power is within you. Never let others decide who you are or what you are worth.